Welcome back to the channel. The Whitmire Ghoul was a terrifying figure that haunted Pensacola, Florida in the late 1950s. The incidents at Whitmire Cemetery caused a wave of panic that lasted for years in this area. The legend became deeply ingrained in the local folklore and was passed down through generations. Even decades later, the tale of the ghoul continues to be remembered and discussed by the old-timers in Pensacola. We're going to unearth the old case file and tell you everything we know. There's details buried in here that very few people have ever heard. Let's get started. Here's what we know. The story starts on the morning of July 12, 1957 at Robert Cemetery on Crichton Road in Pensacola. The thoroughfare is named for the Crichton family, who was very influential in the lumber industry at the time. Many of the tombstones in the Robert Cemetery have the Crichton name on them. The caretaker was making the rounds there when he found that the grave of Ruby Lee Robinson had been disturbed. Now, Robinson was 22 and had died in childbirth the previous November. Her grave was marked by a 1,000-pound slab. The caretaker immediately contacted the sheriff's office. They first thought robbery was a motive, but they learned from the husband that she had not been buried with any valuables and ruled that out. Then on the 22nd of February, 1958, Mrs. Thelma Went of Ferry Pass was visiting the Whitmire Cemetery when she discovered that the grave of 14-year-old Joan Danley had been disturbed. Joan was 14 years old and had died after being hit by a car. The body had not been touched, but it had been exposed. Two things to note: although these cemeteries are not at all close together, they were both located in areas that were considerably remote at the time, back in the late 50s. These areas would be dark, they would be quiet in those days, which lends itself to the terror that was about to unfold. The real incident that was about to make headlines came a month later. On March 8, 1958, Mrs. Tom Holmes discovered the open and empty grave of 11-year-old Suzette Parker at the Whitmire Cemetery. Suzette Parker had passed away on February the 28th after a long illness, and she was buried on March 2nd next to her first cousin, Daniel Paul Parker, who had died the day before her in Texas. The police were immediately notified and began organizing a massive search operation. At approximately 2:30 p.m., County Patrolman Roy Shore found Suzette Parker's remains in heavy brush about 250 yards from the cemetery. He was riding a horse named Trigger, who was startled when he saw them and almost threw him. The young girl was lying on her back, still wearing the pink dress that she had been buried in. Now, when the newspaper reported the story, they wrote, quote, "The body had been taken from the grave by a ghoul." Ghoul. There was more than one ghoul back in those days, and we'll get to a little bit more about that later. The community was gripped by fear. Helicopters were circling overhead. Bloodhounds scoured the area, and mounted patrols were roaming the streets looking for the ghoul. The search for the Whitmire Ghoul became a citywide obsession. Here's what we know about the investigation. To the offense report, which is in the case file, it was noted at the time of burial that her cousin was buried right beside her with another slab. They were right side by side with no markings. It's almost like the ghoul knew which one was Suzette's, perhaps. Her cousin's grave was not disturbed. But the manner in which they removed the vault was that they apparently used a chisel to break open the seal, and then they used some sort of pole or pry bar to raise the lid off the vault, and they used her cousin's grave as a lever to do that with. A search of the area revealed a piece of pipe 4 inches in diameter, approximately 6 inches long, that appeared to be used to help pry the lid open. This piece of pipe was found in the rear of the cemetery, thrown over a wire fence, about 10 feet from the fence. Suzette's body was found lying on her back and her clothes were disarranged. Now, what was not given to the media at the time is that they found burned matches near the body, and also her makeup, that is the rouge and the lipstick that had been put on her at the funeral home, had been removed. They also found burned or scorch marks on the body, apparently from the matches. According to the offense report, they removed the clothing from the body along with the white bottom lining of the casket, which had also been removed, and they sent these to the FBI for examination, which I found really interesting. This was by no means a federal case, so I wondered about them sending it to the FBI. I don't know that it was really routine to send them evidence, unless it was a federal case. They wanted to determine if there was semen on these items. They did make a special note to J. Edgar Hoover that all the graves that had been disturbed were those of women, and that was their concern. The letter was from Elliot Shelby, the sheriff himself. There isn't a response in the case file, but I gather there was no evidence of semen. There is a letter in the case file from J. Edgar Hoover himself saying that he was not returning the items because they probably couldn't get much more off of them. Now, it's also really interesting in this case about the time period because the newspapers immediately started using the word ghoul when referring to this crime. It's a word that comes up a lot in those days in the press. I kind of wanted to know where the word ghoul comes from and how it started being used in this way. It comes from Arabian mythology, and the original ghouls used to hang out in burial grounds, and they were able to change form, but they always had asses' hooves, and that's how you could recognize them. Originally in Arabic, it was spelled a little differently. It was Ghul, but it began to be used to designate any human or demonic cannibal that would be in a graveyard eating people, or it was also used to frighten children to make them behave, which is, I always think it was great to be a kid back in the day because they were always doing those sort of things. Later, it became anglicized, and we get the word ghoul, Ghoul. What was standing out to me at the time is it was around the same time as the Ed Gein case, and I know it was getting a lot of press at the time. So was this some sort of copycat? If you don't remember the Ed Gein case, he was a serial killer in Wisconsin, and his crimes were crazy gruesome. He was a ghoul. He had robbed graves, he killed women, and so many movies, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and Psycho were all sort of derived from the Ed Gein case. It was gruesome. Basically, what you need to know about Ed Gein is that he grew up isolated. His mother was crazy overbearing and very, very weird. He was very isolated. He ended up inheriting his farm after his brother Henry died in suspicious circumstances. And his mom then died and really upset him. And then he started going off. He was actually arrested for killing 2 women in town that everybody knew, and it was pretty easy to trace to him. But once they came to his house, it was a horrific crime scene. They discovered all these bodies. He had been robbing graves. He had been killing people. If you really want to take a deep dive into it, the podcast Morbid did a really, really great job. They did 3 segments on it, really did a deep dive, and I'll put that in the description so you can check it out because they did a really good job of the case if you're interested in doing a deep dive into that. But it was right around the same time, so I wanted to see how it influenced the case, or at least influenced the media coverage of it. The report of the Ed Gein case in the News Journal was not real detailed, but they do mention that they had a police blackout on information, even though the reporters were getting information their own ways. So I'm not sure the average person in Pensacola knew that many intimate details about the Ed Gein case, but you better believe the reporters here did. I know they were probably following it because it was crazy sensational. And it sort of influenced the way they wrote about the Whitmire Ghoul. Here's what we know about the reporting locally. Well, first of all, Sean Cassidy made the paper in 1958, which was cool. In the March 14th, 1958 edition of the Pensacola News Journal, they reported that a pair of men were being questioned in the inquiry about the ghoul and were even taken to jail. Of course. The 2 men, according to Sheriff Emmett Shelby, really knew nothing about the crime and really had nothing to do with the incident, but they were arrested. And the reason they were arrested is the 2 were seen parked near the Roberts Cemetery at night with the lights out. Obviously, this says something ghoulish about it. This is 1958, do you understand? Of course, they freaked out and they fled when they were approached and went towards the airport. And they were finally arrested over at Pensacola Junior College, which is now Pensacola State College. But they had nothing to do with this. When they took them into custody, they found that they had no record, but they were going to keep them for a while and see if they had a record in another state. Now, this time, the reward was up to $800. The local merchants were contributing to the reward about $100 per person, and it had gotten up to be $800. Now, by March 1958, the reward had rose to about $1,500. But nothing else had happened. So not to let a good story go, the Pensacola News Journal went to psychologists or somebody like that. They said authorities to find out what was wrong with the ghoul's head and to see if he was going to do it again. I guess these are psychologists. They just call them authorities. They said that they were two different experts on the human mind. But oddly enough, they don't give their names or where they work or what their criteria is for knowing about this. So I really don't know what makes them experts. I don't know who these people are, so I don't know what to make of their opinions, but most of the notes in this story sound like a jumble of freshman abnormal psych notes. I mean, my freshman notes probably read a lot like this. They say in the article that if you put both of their ideas together, all their points together that the two experts made, you probably get a good picture of what this person was. They said, quote, "It's a picture of a mind wrestling with its own dark urges." Then they started talking about necrophilia. And if you have necrophilia, they just immediately go to that's probably means that this is a schizophrenic, which seems like a huge leap to me in 2025. That they said in the article, in their highly clinical definition of schizophrenic at the time, is someone who has lost touch with reality, quote unquote. Then they go back to the necrophilia and say that it is either sadistic or masochistic, depending on who the authority is. But we don't know who the authorities are, so we don't know who's talking here. So it's kind of hard to decipher. At the end of the day, both of the so-called authorities that they had reached out to were in agreement on one thing, and that is the age of the ghoul. They said, both of them said he was probably between the ages of 18 and 30, or he could be a man of advanced age, one or the other. And they both agreed on this one. So that tells us exactly who we're looking for, right? They weren't done there, though. They went on to say he's probably a shy, quiet person who's inclined to shun the company of others, and he probably leads a really active fantasy life, which is all just the Ed Gein case. I mean, nobody needed to be a psychiatrist just to repeat the information they got interviewing Ed Gein. They also say that it was likely that his mother was severe, undemonstrative, and strict. Also, Ed Gein, just from his testimony. The authorities agree on one thing, however, and that is that the odds are that the struggle against his tendencies will be unsuccessful, and he's going to strike again, and he may do so even though we're guarding all the cemeteries here in Pensacola. And the article ends with, and I just love the ending of this article, this, quote, "This is the ghoul of Whitmire." The case stayed on the mind of the people of Pensacola, and everyone in town was trying to help the sheriff solve the crime. There's an article in the Pensacola News Journal from April 23rd, 1958, that apparently ghouls were robbing graves in Alabama, and maybe, quote, "Did he leave Escambia?" They thought the ghoul might have gone to Alabama. Apparently 150 graves had been disturbed in North Alabama. This comes from the Birmingham News. And they were really looking for what appears to be valuables in these situations. They reported that authorities had 3 coffins that were removed from graves and had never been found. One man told authorities that he had a divining rod used to determine if any valuables or money were hidden in the graves. I imagine he's talking about a metal detector. This is a 60-year-old man that said that he had received information from various magazines that graves had money in them. And I guess he just talked away when he got caught. Because of their use of metal detectors, I imagine they were just looking for valuables in these cases. There was no indication of values being taken from any of the graves in Pensacola. Now, there are a lot of records in the case file, notes from people trying to help the sheriff with his investigation. There's one here that although there's no notation of who exactly told him this, there's a note in the case file that said a certain group called the Vikings Club at Pensacola Technical High School might be at fault. They list a number of people in the club and say they meet at the Vagabond Drive-In restaurant, although they don't think that the restaurant has anything to do with this crime, is responsible for them, or even knows that they meet there for that matter. This place used to be on what is now Fairfield Drive in Pensacola. According to the informant, part of their initiation apparently was to break into a grave and bring back proof of having done so. Also in the case file is a very interesting letter typed on an old typewriter sent to the sheriff, and it reads, "I have just read the story of the Ghoul of Whitmire in the front page detective magazine," which was a very classy magazine of the period. Google it and read some of the headlines. They're very salacious and mostly about women who have behaved badly and suffer the consequences. My favorite headline is from August 1958, "The Short, Violent Life of a Runaway Wife." Catchy. I mean, really, you look at these magazines and you wonder how there weren't more ghouls out there. What I find interesting is that research suggests today that women are more likely to be involved in true crime than men. There are many theories about why women are so interested in true crime stories, and some researchers suggest that women's empathy may make them more interested about the victims of the crime and worry a little bit more about how these affect the communities and the families. But others suggest, and I sort of agree with this, that they're interested because they're trying to sort of learn a little bit more about self-defense and their surroundings so they won't be a victim themselves. But when you look at the true crime pulp fiction of the 1950s, this is all stuff for men, and I just thought that was really interesting. You can drop your thoughts in the comments section. I'd be interested to hear what you think. So getting back to the letter, this is not somebody from Pensacola at all, of course. He just read about it in a magazine, and he's supposing from the artwork in the magazine that the Whitmire Cemetery is a very small one. So he assumed. And because it was a small one, there wouldn't be that many women buried there on a yearly basis. He specifically says women, because I guess they were worried about women's grave primarily. If this is true, he has a suggestion and supposes that everybody probably already thought about it, but he just wanted to make sure they did. His thought was to go to U.S. Army Ordnance and have them build some special anti-personnel mines. Yeah, I think this is a great idea. I think this is a wonderful idea. Why didn't we think about this already? You go on, quote, they would be constructed in such a way that at the end of, say, 10 years, they would become inoperative. Just so much junk. When a young woman's grave was to be filled in, one of your men could tuck an anti-personnel mine in it just below the slab, and you would get your man. He went on to say he understood that there would be risks involved. You think? And the rest of it was scratched out. I guess that was old school redacting. Wonder what he said there. Have no idea. Great ideas all, but none of them worked. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that this thing did happen again. It was reported in the Pensacola News Journal on February the 19th, 1965, that a body of a 46-year-old black woman had been uncovered at Whitmire Cemetery the day before. According to investigators, the clothes of the woman had been disarranged, but there was no evidence that she had been moved or violated. Now, if you look at the case file, it wasn't completely untouched. Her slip had been pulled up. The buttons of her dress had been unbuttoned. She had been touched, and the poor woman had been disturbed. And it's kind of interesting to me that they didn't report that to the media. And because they didn't report that to the media, it didn't get much coverage, and no one got very excited about it. Then, stuck around. And then nothing more. But the story stuck around. Every couple of years it comes back up again in Pensacola. That's what we know. What we don't know is who did it, and we probably won't ever know. Just a note here, I know that paranormal investigators have tried to go into these cemeteries, and the reason this is still remembered in Pensacola is how horrific it was. People are still upset about this, and with good reason. These were loved people, so please don't become part of the problem. If you happen to go to the cemeteries, please show your respect. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in Pensacola history, you may want to check out this video right here. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.